Before Happiness could voice her doubts, she screamed and held onto the man's back tightly. The man had been moving steadily forward, but suddenly leapt into the air. After a momentary pause, he descended rapidly with Happiness in his arms. Happiness clenched her teeth, and the wind whistled in her ears. Looking down from his shoulder, she saw that she was at least dozens of meters away from the steep edge of the hill above. Even though there was thick yellow sand beneath her feet, jumping from such a height would still result in injuries, right? Happiness froze, instinctively holding onto the man tightly. However, the imagined scene of her being severely injured from the fall did not happen. The man's movements were unusually agile and swift. In an instant, they landed on the ground with only a slight thud. Happiness didn't even feel any vibration. She exhaled a breath she had been holding, and stared in astonishment as the other men also jumped down from the 10-story high hill. Now, even if Happiness was slow, she could tell that something was wrong. Special forces on TV weren't that amazing. The country couldn't possibly send people with special abilities to assist in earthquake relief, right? And what exactly was this place? She was just a worthless, impoverished orphan. Who would go through all this trouble to bring her from the earthquake ruins in City C to a real desert? It didn't make any sense. Palfist, Happiness lifted her head and asked, "Where is this place? How far is it from City C? Are you guys from the military?" When the man heard Happiness speaking, he looked down at her. Seeing that her exposed skin was already covered in goosebumps from the cold, he furrowed his brows and lightly touched her arm, seemingly surprised by how cold she was. Then he let her down, unbuttoned his uniform, and took it off, wrapping it around Happiness. The man was tall, at least 1.95 meters, and just his shirt was enough to cover Happiness from her shoulders to her calves. He only wore this one piece of clothing on his upper body, revealing his rugged and muscular physique, exuding endless explosive power with his tanned skin. Happiness became anxious. "I'm asking you, where is this place? Is this not City C? What happened after the earthquake?" The man lifted Happiness up again, shook his head, and uttered a string of strange syllables. His voice was deep and extremely magnetic, exuding a full masculine charm. But Happiness couldn't understand a single word. Happiness suddenly felt afraid, a ridiculous idea swirling in her mind. Could it be that she had traveled through time during the earthquake? Wasn't this plot only found in fiction? But besides time travel, what else could explain her current situation? The man pulled up his collar, covering her mouth and nose. Then, he made a gesture to the other men. With a kick, he shot forward about 10 meters away, moving much faster than before. It made Happiness feel like she was in a speeding vehicle. The cold wind blew open her collar and entered her mouth. Her breathing stopped for a moment. She quickly grabbed her collar and covered half of her face. Her heart was pounding nervously. She comforted herself silently, saying that it wouldn't be a big deal if she really encountered time travel. After all, she had no family or connections. As long as she had food to eat, she could survive anywhere. These physically abnormal humans, at least in terms of their clothing, belonged to modern civilization. They saved her, so they probably didn't have any ill intentions towards her. Maybe she would even encounter someone who could speak Chinese in the future, and then all the mysteries would be solved. Suddenly, the man's footsteps stopped. The two men beside him immediately approached, and exchanged short syllables with him. Happiness tried hard to discern this completely unfamiliar language, and found that it didn't belong to any foreign language she had ever heard. The two men seemed to be asking the man a question. When the man nodded in response, they buried a cylindrical object in the nearby sand, played with it for a while, and suddenly it emitted a bright light as bright as daylight. It shone brightly within a radius of 10 miles. Happiness covered her eyes with her hand due to the stimulating light, but couldn't help but peek through her fingers. After a few minutes, continuous roars came from the north. Happiness was shocked and looked in that direction. She could vaguely see many indistinct figures, moving towards this side at a not slow pace under the light beam. The man who manipulated the cylindrical object spread his hands in her direction, and said something with a seemingly disappointed tone. The man who accompanied him patted his shoulder, trying to console him through his actions. The crowd from the north approached closer. Her eyes widened, almost unable to believe what she saw. The wind blowing from the desert brought a strong and pungent smell. The creatures moving towards the light beam were simply a group of monsters. Only a small part of them barely resembled human forms, but their limbs and bodies had long decayed. Some were dried up, while others had blood-red flesh hanging outside, resembling the zombies from European and American movies. Her hair stood on end, and every cell in her body was screaming. Where on earth had she traveled to? In the blink of an eye, the two men who were still near the light beam had disappeared. Her eyes couldn't keep up with their speed. She only saw them shooting into the crowd of monsters like arrows, with heads, limbs, and internal organs flying everywhere. These horrifying monsters were dismantled by them bare-handedly, without using any weapons. Just like that, a large group of monsters, which seemed to number in the hundreds, were dismembered. It was like a bloody scene from a movie, and Happiness was on the verge of tears. Even if it was a prank by a TV station, it wouldn't be on such a grand scale. Where on earth had she traveled to? As an ordinary person who hadn't even killed a chicken, how could she survive in this world with monsters and superhumans? The two human meat grinders searched through the pile of bodies. Finally, they seemed to find something, and one of them picked it up and walked towards Happiness. She finally caught a glimpse of it. It seemed that the man carrying her was the leader of this group. He had to report everything and seek permission. The man in his hand was holding an oval-shaped object, emitting a faint metallic cold light. He cursed and then flicked his fingers. Happiness watched as the lump of metal turned into powder in his hand and scattered with the wind. Are these people really human? Happiness took a deep breath and shivered for a moment. The leader of the group misunderstood her trembling and immediately ordered the team to set off. He personally took care of Happiness from start to finish and had no intention of handing her over to his subordinates. Alexander, what race is this female evolution from? The man who crushed the metal objects approached Happiness. Seeing her clear black eyes staring at him, without blinking, he found it interesting. She's female, right? I can't tell her race, but she should be female. Alexander tightened the small body in his arms. She is the first female to evolve into human form. I didn't expect such a big harvest from this trip. Why do you think she evolved in the 5th Zone desert area? Judging by her size, isn't she still a child? The man continued to excitedly ask with an uncontrollable excitement. Ben, take off your clothes. This female is still trembling, Alexander said. Oh, it's strange, it's not even cold tonight, Ben complained, but obediently took off his clothes and let Alexander wrap another layer around Happiness. Ben couldn't help but itch and said, Alexander, when we get back, let me be the second one, okay? In fact, all these men were very excited, including the leader Alexander. Their direction of evolution was towards human form, and in the continuous evolution and recombination of genes, the deepest and most primitive desire was to reproduce with a true female in human form. Unfortunately, for hundreds of years, no female of any race had evolved into human form, so one can imagine how rare Happiness was in their eyes. Female humans only existed in historical records and books. I don't think it's possible for her to be sent to the breeding camp, Alexander said. Seeing the second man who took off his clothes to keep her warm looking at her, with shining eyes while talking to the person holding her, Happiness effortlessly analyzed that they were talking about her. She didn't miss any opportunity to please them, and quickly loosened her collar. Her beautiful black eyes narrowed into crescent moons as she smiled at them, the soft starlight reflecting her fair skin. She didn't know how much stimulation her innocent and sweet smile caused them again, but Happiness was determined about one thing: she must hold on to this living tree in front of her, otherwise she wouldn't survive a day in this monstrous world. Alexander, look, she's smiling at me, she doesn't dislike me, Ben happily said. He wished he could immediately hug this female and get close to her, but obviously Alexander would not agree. Seeing the person next to her smile back, Happiness felt a little relieved. Well, isn't a smile the best weapon of humans? They responded to her kindness, which meant her safety was more assured. This also further proved that these powerful humans had advanced intelligence, they just couldn't communicate in the same language. Language barriers can be slowly overcome. What does it matter? Happiness told herself, as long as there's no life-threatening situation. This female's body is small, but being able to evolve means she's already an adult. Alexander, check her reproductive organs. Another man came from behind, and gave Lynn Happiness a smile, but said something in a language she couldn't understand. Let's talk about it later. Alexander discreetly blocked the hand Lou reached out. Although the females in the breeding camp were shared by everyone, he suddenly didn't want any other males to touch this small female in his arms.